This is not a test. Stay calm in an orderly fashion. Make your way to the lifeboats.
Mayday, the ship is sinking.
All right, so welcome back, everybody, to our Friday cast of Lifeboat Addiction Recovery Cast. My name is Christian Paul, and I'm really excited because today we're going to be interviewing, she's a very good friend of mine. She's an amazing voice, not only in the recovery community in Jackson, but in the ministry community in Jackson. She is somebody who is very big on social justice. I love her to death because she speaks her mind, and she'll tell you where to get and where to go and all that kind of stuff. So I want to welcome Myisha Cunningham, but we all call her Uni. So Uni, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to do this. When you first brought it up, I was like, yes, because I listened to to one of the other episodes. I think it was the first episode. And I was like, this is a good thing they've got going on here.
I'm thank you so much. And thank you so much for doing this for us. We're really, really excited. I mean, you're doing a lot of really cool things. I know of some of the things you got going, but I'd love for you to tell some of the listeners and viewers of the things that you got going, because I mean, you just have a passion for this. I've seen you in different domains. It's just like, wow, this person is so on fire. They've got it going on. So I don't want to stave it off any longer. So Uni, could you tell the listeners about your personal experience with recovery?
Well, yeah. I'm a person in long-term recovery myself. That means that I haven't had a drink or mood mind-altering substance for 12 years now. April 1st will make
That's awesome.
13 years, God willing. Yeah. So that's my history with substance use disorder. I also have co-occurring disorders. So I am familiar with that whole struggle of what happens within the mind, and then how you can connect that with getting recovery and how difficult that can often be. Dealing with mental illness, mental health, and then also dealing with substance use disorder or alcohol use disorder is often shamed and not talked about in such a public forum. And so that's what I hope to be able to change, is to break down some of that stigma, even if it upsets some people in different fellowships, that don't want to bring attention to certain fellowships, and they have this anonymity principle, which I am 100% in support of anonymity, of course, but I believe anonymity is your choice. And so for mine, I choose to speak publicly about my substance use disorders and my co-occurring disorders as well.
Well, I'm so excited that you're so bold and stepping out, because we need more people that have that candor and that want and willingness. So, Uni, you do a lot of stuff. I'm wondering if you can explain to our listeners, what all do you do?
How many hats do I wear?
Yes.
Okay, so probably too many hats, but I love what I do. So I do work in the recovery community. So I'm also a pastor. I'm ordained in the Free Methodist Denomination, and I'm the senior recovery pastor at Raven Brook Recovery Church, which is here in Jackson. We are 100% a church, but then also 100% 12-step. So it's a unique blend of those two experiences coming together to create a community that's intentional about Jesus being our higher power and what that looks like for us to walk out in our recovery. So that's the first hat. We've got Pastor Uni, right? That's the first hat. The second thing that I do is I am the CEO and founder of Ravens Coaching, which is a recovery coaching organization here in Jackson as well. To learn more about that, it is ravenscoaching.com, by the way, to check out more information about that. And so through recovery coaching, I get to reach people that would not walk through the doors of a church. So I've got, on one hand, I'm ministering to those who are willing to walk through the doors of a church and hear about Jesus. But then through recovery coaching, I'm getting people who will not walk through the doors of the church, but maybe they need something else. I get to help them figure out what it is that works for them and helps them sustain their recovery, which to me is a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. And I really appreciate it. And it is a passion of mine. So me working in the community and also being an addict or an alcoholic, I can choose to call myself that, but no one else can. Heads up with the language there, because we have certain language that we use about when addressing substance use disorder and alcohol use disorder and so forth. But for me, I like to remind myself that I am an addict and I am an alcoholic, not in a derogatory sense, but in a sense of Christ is helping me to overcome this in my life.
Awesome.
And so I'm able to face that and hold that mirror up and say, this is who I was, and yet this is who I want to be and who God is calling me to be. So those are the two main things that I've got going on. Couple other things you mentioned, social justice. I am a member of the NAACP and the chapter here in Jackson. And so I love social justice. And I believe that social justice is part of the gospel and it's not separate from the gospel at all. So I just dropped 3 big things for you.
No, I think that awesome. I mean, and it's so cool to be a witness, to be able to see the interplay between all of those things that you just said. I've been, kind of the outside observer, and it's just it's amazing for you to be able to balance all those things. Is just so impressive and so cool. So you mentioned a lot there. I want to unpack all this for our listeners. So can you tell our viewers or listeners a little bit about your ministry, kind of what called you into ministry, and did your recovery have a portion to play in that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually was called to be a pastor while I was still sitting in active addiction. I was sitting at a bar and I was drunk as can be, and I could very clearly hear God calling me to be a pastor, which is shocking, right? Because at that point, I wasn't even, I had walked away from the church. I didn't want anything to do with the church. And part of that reason was because I started drinking when I was 10. And I started, trying other drugs when I was 13 and 14. And so I brought this to the church and was like, I kind of need help. Something's not right. And, I was trying to cope with traumatic events that had happened to me and going through sexual abuse. And so that's why I ended up experimenting with drugs and alcohol to begin with. So I bring this to the church and the church is like, oh, you're fine. You're a pretty girl. You've come from a nice family. Your grandparents, talking about my grandparents, you'll be fine. There's nothing really wrong with you. And so the deeper I got and the harder my heart became, and the more pain that I experienced, I just didn't want anything to do with this God that people talked about. So you fast forward, and I grew up in the church, I should say too. And so you fast forward, and so here I am sitting in this bar, and I'm like, excuse me, I haven't heard your voice in a long time. Where have you been at? And, I haven't heard from you, and this is what I hear. This is what I very clear, hear God saying. It just didn't make any sense. So I ran from it. And I ran from it from a couple of years, but within 2 years of sitting in that bar, I began to embark on my journey in recovery. And trying different things, trying 12-step things, trying non-spiritual approaches, trying spiritual approaches. I still didn't want it really anything to do with the God thing. So 12-step was actually pretty abhorrent to me. I didn't like that because it mentioned God and I didn't want anything to do with that. But within 2 years, I began to embark on that journey. And through that journey, God began to peel back layers of myself. And I got into therapy and I really put my recovery first and took it serious. I took it as if, how you have someone who's in college and they're learning, they're very intentional, right? They're intentional about going to classes. They're intentional about making sure they're studying and reading their books. I had to be intentional with that same mentality with my recovery, but addressing it as I'm a lifelong learner of my recovery. So this isn't something that's going to go away. This is something that I'm going to have to continue to learn and evolve and grow. And so you fast forward at about 5-year mark, I finally, at that point, I came back to church. I was living with my grandparents, and I was living with them, and things were going pretty well. But that call to be a pastor still never let up. It was still there, and I can't really describe what that call was like. Only pastors really get that.
Yeah.
Only pastors really understand how that feels to be drawn towards something that is bigger than yourself. And it's scary, and you don't know what it means, and you don't know where it's going to lead you. And so throughout that process, I tried other careers that I was pretty good at and I enjoyed, like dental assisting. Love dental assisting. Business management. I was an area manager for fast food chain restaurants. So like I've done these things, and even taxi cab services. So like I've done these different careers because I really didn't want to pursue being a pastor. So I tried all these other things. And at that point I was still in the church, though. I went back to the church, and so I was leading in the church. I was leading ministries. I was leading people to Christ. And I was still like, God, I don't want nothing to do with this.
Maybe not, maybe so.
All
We'll
right.
figure it out.
And so finally, when I was 30 years old, I submitted. I submitted to that call to be a pastor. At that point, I didn't know what that meant as far as joining my faith to a recovery church. Hadn't really gotten to that point yet, but at that point I had accepted at least, you know what, God, I believe that you're calling me to this, and I'm done running. So I had my moment of Jonah and the fish for like, I want to say 8 years of ignoring that.
That's absolutely amazing.
Yeah. So that's the initial call. That was the initial call that I had. Now, when we're talking about how did the recovery church come about?
Yeah, definitely explain that. So for viewers and listeners, your recovery church, it's, there are recovery churches in the nation, but your recovery church is very unique because of a couple of specific things. And those things I think are crucial to how I perceive recovery needs to continue on into the future as far as, its interaction with the religious domain. So please tell us all about it.
Yeah. So in case you haven't picked up on a theme, the prophetic has always played a major part in my life. And there's many other situations where the prophetic voice of God has spoken truth into my life, and things came to pass that were true.
Now, I'm wondering if you could, before you go on, could you explain what you mean by prophetic for the listeners?
Yeah, prophetic is simply hearing the voice of God. That is what prophecy is. It is hearing the voice of God, because the voice of God doesn't lie, and everything the voice of God says comes to pass. So it's just hearing the voice of God in your life. And so that's what that looked like for me. And so at this point, this was 2 years ago. Well, I'll say 3 years ago. I was sitting at a conference for my denomination, and our bishop had got up and preached and did this great sermon. And then at the end, during the middle of it, once again, I heard God say, Recovery Church. Now, I was already a pastor. I was a youth pastor and the associate pastor at a church here in Jackson called 1208 Greenwood. And so I was walking in that calling to be a pastor, but then I heard God say, Recovery Church. I had been feeling like God wanted me to plant a church and leave where I was at, but I didn't know what kind of church, what that needed to look like. And so at this conference, I heard him say Recovery Church. So I wrote it down. I was like, I wrote the word down that I got. I said, I'll test this word later. So I'm at a conference. I'm not going to think about it. So at the end of the bishop preaching, a friend of mine who was sitting clear across the room, was nowhere near me. There's no way this person could have seen what I wrote on my paper. He used to be the pastor of Spring Arbor Free Methodist Church. His name's Mark Van Valen. And so a very godly man. And he walked up to me and he said, Recovery Church. And my mouth just dropped. And I was like, why are you telling me that? And he's like, I don't know. And I'm like, well, that's confirmation. Because at that point, I had never heard of recovery and church being united together. Heard of recovery, I'm in recovery. Heard of church, I'm in church, but never heard of the two. And so, so I spent a year, I spent 6 months wrestling with that calling, because I didn't want to leave where I was at, to be honest. I was comfortable. I had a steady paycheck. I knew the people. I was helping. The ministry was growing. Like, I didn't want to just like up and leave that. It was cozy for me. So I really had some hesitancy. And, but then it all automatically boiled down to, am I going to be obedient to who God is calling me to be, or am I going to continue to make excuses? So that's what I was faced with, obedience or excuse. And so I chose obedience. And so got to work on planning this church. And so after we kind of got an idea of what we wanted our services to look like, that's when I discovered that there are other recovery churches throughout the U.S. There's a whole recovery church movement that started by now a friend of mine called Phil DeVroe down in Florida. But at that time, I didn't know anyone. I'd never heard of that. And our church is slightly different than theirs, while it's still remaining true to being a recovery church. But what's very unique about Raven Brook is the story of the name. The name of Raven Brook was a very unique name that was intentionally chosen. And so it comes from in 1 Kings, where you have the prophet Elijah, and he's like running from the crazy queen who wants to kill him. She's already killed other prophets. He runs into the woods because God tells him, if you go into the woods, my ravens will feed you. I'll send my ravens to feed you. And so here you have this uncomfortable moment, because if you know anything about Jewish history or anything about the Old Testament prior to 1 Kings, you would know that ravens are considered unclean. And so no Jewish man would allow himself to be tainted by a raven, even if that raven's trying to feed him. He would never do that. And so yet we see God using something that people consider to be dirty to bring life. And that's exactly how I felt I was treated throughout my life in my recovery. By other people, by the stigma. I was treated as if I was dirty, as if I was untouchable. Stay away from her. She's probably going to steal out of your purse, or she's going to rob you blind, or she's going to manipulate you, or whatever else, kind of things that people like to say about us. And so in that moment, there was healing. And so at the core of who we are at Raven Brook is we're simply just a healing ministry.
That's phenomenal. I want to kind of go back because I think we've talked in this podcast before, myself and my co-host Hunter, we've talked about what we like to call spiritual resonance, when the intrinsic voice, the voice that we hear in our own head, matches the external voice, which is the voice that we are from trusted individuals that we cultivate. And when those two things match, it all of a sudden becomes like this really profound, like earth-shaking moment of like something is happening here. It's divine, or it's proof of the divine presence. It's proof of divinity. It's like God is here. He is present. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to, you've had that moment before, especially in starting the recovery church. Have you had those moments since then in starting the recovery church and walking through this process?
Those divine intervention moments. Yeah, for certain. I can see, so oftentimes, recently, those divine moments where I can clearly see God working happens where he takes something that is meant to be harmful, something that's negative, and he takes that and he turns it and uses it for my good. He doesn't cause the negativity to hurt me, but he uses the situation to bring good to my life and to help change and to help bring transformation to others and things like that. So that is definitely how I've been experiencing God lately, especially during this pandemic. So like, for example, when we first when the church finally, when they first just went on pause for meeting inside meeting inside buildings, when that first happened, when we first went into that lockdown, our church didn't have a worship leader yet. We had only been in existence for 6 months. So we have a 6-month-old church, and then we get a pandemic. So, as you can imagine, that would shake your foundations. You would start asking those big questions like, am I really called to this? God, are you really with me in this? Those questions of faith, those hard questions start to come up when you're facing those types of situations. And so throughout that, I could see the faithfulness of God. And one very profound way is that I had been trying for a year and a half before, well, a year before those 6 months before we launched, to find a worship leader. And we just couldn't find one. And what church doesn't have a worship leader?
Sure.
Right. And so like, it's awkward. And so it was such a huge need. And yet in the middle of that pandemic, God dropped someone in my lap to be a worship leader. It's like, what? That just doesn't even make sense. And it happened out of nowhere. This person came up to me and approached me, and I knew them. It wasn't a stranger. Like, I knew them, but it just happened out of nowhere. And so in that, I could see the faithfulness of God, that like, God does have my best interest at heart. And even though this situation is difficult, and that situation may have caused me to pause and question things, that's okay. That's how we process. There's often a disconnect between emotional intelligence and our spirituality. People tend to think that those things can't exist, but the truth is, if you are emotionally unstable or emotionally not mature, we'll say it that way, how are you supposed to be spiritually mature? And so there comes a point where you have to be okay with questioning God and with processing things and with asking difficult questions, because that's how we're going to grow. And that's where we're going to see God the most, during those times when we're like, I don't know what else to do.
Yeah.
I have to let go. I don't know what else to do. There's nothing else I can do. And that's what I felt like with that church during the pandemic. Lord, I don't know what to do. It's not like there's a blueprint. I can't read a book about this. This doesn't exist. This has never happened until now. So like, what are pastors supposed to do with this? We're thrusted into a situation where we either evolve or we die.
Yeah.
And that is true for our spirituality. That is true for our recovery as well. We either evolve or we die. And we had to do that during a pandemic, not being able to go to in-person meetings and fellowship meetings. I'm not going to say the names of those, but if you're in recovery, you understand what fellowships are. But, not being able to go to those face-to-face meetings, you evolve or you die. You do the next best thing. And the next best thing was jumping on Zoom and still getting that connection and still having those social interactions with people. That was difficult for many of us in recovery, but that was something that we had to do in order to continue to grow. And so those are some ways where I see those things intersecting.
Yeah. Wow. So I would be remiss, you have a lot of really unique things specifically about your ministry. I am wondering if you could speak a little bit to how does your ministry best present recovery? What does your ministry do to focus on recovery, because it is a recovery church?
Right. So a question that people often ask me is, what's the difference between your church and Celebrate Recovery? Okay. So what's the difference between that? And the difference is that Celebrate Recovery is a ministry that's within a existing church, whereas Recovery Church, Raven Brook, our entire ministry is focused and catered to those with substance or alcohol use disorders. So that means every ministry, every focus, everything that we're intentional with, every lens that we view our community or interact with those in our community are done through the lens of recovery. It's done through the lens of we are trying to reach the addict and the alcoholic. And that's what sets us apart. So like, not to say that there's anything wrong with other ministries that aren't focused on those with substance or alcohol use disorder. Absolutely not. No, but it's just that we have a niche, and that's our niche. Is it niche or niche?
I've heard of both.
I'm gonna go with niche. That's our niche. Is that our focus is through that lens. Everything we do is done through the lens of recovery, in hopes to bring peace and hope and transformation into others' lives. So a couple of practical ways we integrate that within our church that's unique to us. As you noticed, I call myself the senior recovery pastor. First off, calling yourself a recovery pastor, never heard that done before. Heard a pastor, heard of, this pastor of this, but never really heard someone use the phrase recovery pastor and it be a normal thing. So I identify off the rip that I'm not a normal pastor. I've done all those other types of pastoring and different genres and focusing on different ministries, but I've never, but my focus is on recovery. That is where I'm going to automatically go. Doesn't mean I'm going to not, interact with other types of ministries. Of course, we're all part of the body of Christ, but that just means my focus is on that. And so through that identification, but then we also have something that we call recovery discipleship. And so recovery discipleship is where, once a year, I walk a group of people through the steps, and I do it through the lens of Christianity. It's not through the lens of anything else. It is unapologetically Jesus.
Yes.
Working the steps, unapologetically Jesus. So I have like handouts of the curriculum that I designed where, they explain the steps, but through the lens of Jesus. And so what they do is they unite the Bible and they unite the 12 steps, which oftentimes in most churches, people try to separate them. Where you go to a regular church, or if you go to a church that's familiar with recovery, you might get all Jesus, but you won't get any 12-step, and they surely will tell you not to go to therapy. Whereas we're like, no, we're into holistic healing. That means healing for the mind, the body, and the spirit. So yeah, we're going to unite what that looks like. We're going to encourage mental health. We're going to encourage getting social workers. We're going to encourage that you have a recovery coach, and we're going to encourage that we're unapologetically Jesus and we're 12-step. So that's what makes us different.
That's awesome. And yeah, I would say, especially what we know about like the Oxford group and the development of AA, it's absolutely needed. So before I get into kind of discussing the broader spectrum of things, especially in relation to social justice and what's happening now, I just want to kind of a quick shot a couple of different questions specifically about like the recovery community. So these questions are multi-layered. I would like you to answer for like the local recovery community, what you're seeing, and then kind of the national recovery community, what you're seeing. So first, what do you hope never changes in your local recovery community and then in the national recovery community?
So locally, that's a really good question, actually. What I hope to never see change in my local recovery community is an absence of different pathways to recovery. So some people are uncomfortable with that. And some people are uncomfortable with that phrase, especially because I'm a pastor, because in one sentence, I just said Jesus, right? And yet now I'm talking about multiple pathways to recovery. So some people think that that's contradictory. But in reality, it's not, because it meets people right where they are. That means I'm going to show people the love and respect and see their humanity for who they are. And I'm going to meet them right where they are, even if they don't want anything to do with Jesus, but just maybe my kindness and love throughout the years will make an impact, and they'll get to actually see what it looks like to have someone who actually follows Jesus. And so, and trusting God in that process. So it's not proselytizing by any means, but I hope to see multiple pathways to recovery in our local community throughout the years to come.
Good stuff. And then what do you see as kind of like the national, is there any trends that you're seeing nationally that you're like, man, that's awesome. I really hope that they keep that?
Oh, definitely. The move of recovery coaching organizations, right? That's still growing. That's still growing at a national level. And more people are beginning to explore and learn what that looks like and how integral that is to someone's recovery, and how you have a much higher rate of sustaining your recovery if you have a recovery coach. You know, your chances are greater if you have a recovery coach of staying sober, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's awesome. Okay. So what would you say, kind of flip coin, what is your biggest fear for the recovery movement? I mean, we could blow it out a little bit and talk about COVID in particular, but what do you think is your biggest fear for the recovery movement right now? Like, what are you seeing? And kind of like, that's not a good quality.
Right. Locally, we'll start again with locally. So locally where I'm at, the thing that makes me nervous is well, our community is very much anti-Jesus. The majority of those in recovery in Jackson don't want anything to do with Jesus. And so for me, that obviously that's where I want to be in ministry, but it's also a difficult place at the same time. So it's like part of me is where I wish that we could break down those walls and see, change happen where there'll be a little bit more open to that. But in all honesty, I understand why. And the reason why is because there was a local church here whose pastor was in recovery, and he was very vocal about it. And he told people not to take their psych meds. He told them not to go to the hospital. So he had a bunch of people overdose. And some people lost their battle because he said, all you need is Jesus. You don't need anything else. And while I understand the notion of, yes, Jesus is my all in all, but Jesus gives us logic. He gives us logic, and he gives people intelligence for a reason. He's provided resources for us to use those resources. And so I see that balance happening. And so because that happened, though, that has scared off so many people in this recovery community. They're not receptive to hearing Jesus because of that. Yeah. So I would hope that would be able to change.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment. I see that quite a bit. I mean, in our local recovery community, also. So, what do you absolutely determined to see happen in the recovery community, or in the recovery movement as a whole in your lifetime? So, what's something that's like, this has got to happen before I leave this earthly plane?
That's a really difficult question, Christian.
What we're here for.
Oh man. Something that I would like to see in my lifetime is I would like to see a recovery church in at least one in every state.
Mm.
It doesn't seem like much, but in my lifetime, I'd like to see at least one recovery church in every state where they're registered, like with the recovery church movement specifically, because on their website, if you're traveling or something like that, you can go to their website and you can find a recovery church that's where you're traveling. And you can attend that, so that way you're still getting your support. If you're, in the business where you're traveling a lot or things like that, you can still, connect with people. And so I would love to see that. I would love to see that happen.
That's such an admirable goal, and I think it's a realistic goal too, for sure. So, what are some things that you had to unlearn since you've started your recovery journey? This is always a fun question.
That I had to unlearn, huh? It really doesn't matter how much experience I have. It doesn't matter what I've learned. It doesn't matter. My credentials don't matter. I can't make someone accept recovery.
Mm.
No matter how much I want them to walk in that freedom, I can't make them. And that was difficult for me. And so, I grew up, both my parents were addicts. So that's why I had to live with my grandparents every couple years, because my parents couldn't take care of me. And so, my mom and my dad, they had like a 25-year addiction, and they've been clean for the past 9 years. And prior to that, though, I never thought that recovery is a reality. I never thought that people actually recovered, or could recover, not in the sense that you'll never be an addict, but in the sense where you're prioritizing your recovering, you're walking in your sobriety and what that looks like. I didn't think that was a real possibility with my family. And so when it finally happened for me, I was, it tainted my thoughts. It made me think, well, this finally happened with your parents after this whole long battle. So because they can do it, that means that everybody that you'll interact with, they'll get to walk in that too. Yay. And so I actually went into this with that naivety, because it, like, the heart was right, but it wasn't realistic, because I got to walk my parents through their recovery process from the gate of active use into where they are now. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, though, I thought, well, if they can do this, then I can do this with anybody. And that's not always the reality of it. So.
Wow. Yeah, that's I right there with you. I saw that quite a bit on early on in my recovery too. So I want to use the last kind of 15 minutes that we have with each other, because you said out of the three things that you were really focused on, out of the many other things that you have going on, that you are an active member of your local NAACP. Yeah. I would love for you to be able to talk a little bit about kind of the social justice issues as it relates maybe to recovery, important social justice issues that you think like this isn't getting enough attention. Maybe it's something that we need to focus more on. So first and foremost, how do you believe social justice issues in recovery meld with each other?
Well, besides the blatant disrespect towards the prior administration had towards those in recovery, like with Biden's son being insulted because of his substance use disorder, by the administration right there, that's already put us into a place where we have to actually question and see that politics make a difference even in the lives of those in recovery. Because what I see is, a lot of people I know who are in recovery, they could care less about politics. They're just trying to stay clean, right? Mm-hmm. They don't care about that. They don't think it affects them. But then when you're dealing with situations where you hear an insult towards someone who was battling substance use disorder, like President Biden's son, that's an insult to all of us in recovery. And so that causes us to pause and say, you know what, maybe politics do affect us. And maybe not having access to um, to inpatient treatment, that's a barrier. And
Sure.
that can be something that we see not only just on the political atmosphere, but that also gets into social justice, because what social justice is, it is trying to make things equal. So social justice at its heart is equality. And so you're identifying places where you don't see equality happening. Like you don't see equality happening in drug court for Black clients. Why is it that most drug courts, unless they are in a predominantly Black city, they're filled with only white people?
Mm.
Why is that? The drug court here in Jackson, when I was working for drug court, there was only like 3 Black people out of like 100.
Mm.
Why is that? It's not because they didn't qualify, but it's because there is systems that were put in place that were designed to oppress people of color. And people argue with that, but you can't argue with that because these systems were designed when there was still slavery.
Sure.
So if something was designed during slavery, do you think that 100 years from then, they're still not going to oppress Black people? Those systems? Of course they will, because that's what they were designed to do. And so that's a practical way that I see disparages between races in dealing with how the justice system treats us. And then you have the whole opioid epidemic versus the crack epidemic, handled completely different.
Yeah.
Okay. The war on drugs that happened in the 80s locked up so many Black men. That's why they say that it's the modern day slavery.
They couldn't they
Mass
tried to
incarcerate.
incarcerate
Yeah,
their way out of
mass
the problem. They couldn't
incarceration.
build prisons fast enough.
Right. So it's like, let's not get these Black people the help that they need with their addictions. Let's just lock them up. But then when you have the opioid crisis come in, where it affects mostly white people, they get treatment, they get laws changed. It's sure some of them, are dealing with the ramifications of the justice system. Of course, they're not just they don't often just walk away with a slap on the wrist. But the point is that they are handled much different. This situation was handled much different. They're not so fast to lock them up. They're more inclined to get them the help that they need. So from the very beginning of these two epidemics, you can see that there is an inconsistency. There was an inequality in the way that those things were handled and still are handled today. Now that we've legalized marijuana, what does that mean for the large offenses who were not violent, who are Black men sitting in prison for the next 20 years because they had a couple of grams on them?
Yeah.
Because it was their third offense, but they've never done anything violent, but they had a couple grams. Now they're facing 20 years. What does that mean for them? And now it's legal. So I definitely see how there's intersectionality happening between social justice and the way that people are treated in regards to recovery. And so that's kind of like what I think. Heavy stuff.
I think no. I mean, I'm happy. I'm happy that you spoke honestly about that, because I couldn't agree more. I do see there's ridiculous disparities in a lot of things, and I think the unfortunate part is people oftentimes relegate, especially in the situation of the obscene amount of Black men that were incarcerated because of crack cocaine possession versus white men who use heroin, or opioid epidemic. And people say, well, the science wasn't there, it wasn't up to snuff or whatever. It's like, yeah, it wasn't, but the only reason it became up to snuff is because it started to happen over here. Because when it started to happen to the majority instead of the minority, that's when problems started to happen. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's clear. It can't be argued. You see it all over. I mean, there's paper trails a mile long that's the case. So to kind of finish up, just on the same line of questioning, you had said early on, you see social justice in the gospel. They complement each other. So could you explain that a little bit more for us? How do you view that? How do you walk that out as being a recovery pastor, which I love that term. So a recovery pastor and a local member of the NAACP. How do you roll that out?
Yeah. So the first thing is I'm going to be working with my local chapter of the NAACP on something called religious affairs that the NAACP has. It's a branch that is focused on that relationship between the church and social justice, which has been there since the existence of the NAACP. The church has always been part of that. Obviously, the biggest figure you'd see would be like Martin Luther King Jr., right? But there's so many others who are part of that. So that's always been there. But I like to phrase this through the question of, is social justice a diversion from the gospel? And I phrase this question that way because there are so many people who think that social justice is contrary to the gospel. And I'm arguing that it's not. And we see, like, for example, in Acts chapter 6, we see that the Grecian Jews were complaining because the Hebraic Jews were neglecting their widows. They weren't giving them food. So the Hebraic Jews were just kind of letting everybody down. Now, and on the surface, you don't see this and think, oh, social justice. But in reality, what was happening is that culturally, they were still struggling with like classism. And so there was an inequality between the Jews. And so from the beginning, you see like in Acts chapter 6, oh, this is about social justice. And it's not surprising. Now, in the Old Testament, we see tons and tons of scriptures, right? You see like Zechariah, you see Isaiah, Amos, Micah, they all call for learning to do good and seeking justice, correcting oppression, pleading the widow's cause, etc., right? Or taking care of the poor, taking care of those who can't speak for themselves. We see that. And so in Acts chapter 6, though, their negligence to take care of those widows was essentially like looking at Jesus and saying, meh, Jesus didn't really care about people either, so why should I? That's what people would do if they neglect that. And so you argue, did Jesus care about social justice? Did Jesus do social justice? Right? Because what do we do when we think about the gospel? We water it down to only talk about, well, this is about being in relationship with God. No, the gospel is about integrating my relationship with God into every area of my life. And so that means, so it's bigger than just you and your relationship with God, but the gospel is global. It's bigger than you. And so things that you've seen Jesus doing that that's the gospel, that you see him interacting with social justices, you see where he took care of people spiritually and physically, right? He didn't just say, oh, you're hungry? Well, screw you. Sorry, let me heal you. And you're still hungry. But no, he fed people. He took care of people. He taught people. He made people equal in situations where people would normally not have power. So you think about the woman who washed his feet with her tears and her hair. Here she is walking into a room full of men who all think that she's a sinner, and she had no business being there. She had no power. She was a woman. Women didn't have power. And nagged on that she was a sinner in their eyes. Oh, no, she didn't need to be there. And yet Jesus put his power on the line by welcoming her acts and defending her. When you read that, he defended her. So he gave power to a situation and to a person that would normally not have power. And if that isn't social justice, Like, I don't know what is,
Sure.
you know?
Sure. Well, I will say, Uni, I really appreciated this conversation. I appreciate everything that you're doing and continue to do. Is there any kind of last minute things that you want to say or that you want to plug or anything like that, like Raven Brook or anything like that?
Yeah. So I'll end with this. I'm gonna end with Galatians 3:28. And it says, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So since we're all one with Christ, no one being above or having an advantage over another, that means that we should acknowledge and dismantle systems and structures that were designed to threaten that oneness. And so that's what I want to end with, is that we walk in pursuing equality, because literally God wrote it, that we're one. And so if we're one, then that means that we should fight against situations that threaten that and that go contrary to God's word.
Well, great way to end it. Thank you so much, Uni Cunningham, Myisha. You are awesome. You are awesome on all the things that you do. You're awesome in the community that you're a part of, and I continue to wish you success. For those of you listening, that wraps up our Friday podcast. If you're listening now, go ahead and tune in to Monday. Monday, we are talking about ACEs training, adverse childhood experience, where Dr. Bob Powell and his partner are going to be teaching that. But other than that, have a great day.